I remember many years ago, before I was priested, even before I went to seminary, I was taking my dog to the vet. That doesn't sound very biblical, does it? And while I was there, someone came blowing in through the door to get his dog. It was a Monsignor. I know that by the way he was dressed. Full of this, well, not cope and things, but full of this kind of vestments. Very fancy, red shoes, the whole bit. And I thought, wow, I hope you were really in a hurry and just didn't have time to change, maybe. I didn't hope to see him in the grocery store in those clothes. But I have to admit that when it's time for church, I love to put on my vestments. I like to put on a tashma. Sometimes I never wear a cope. They make me feel sort of hunched over, and they kind of remind me of football capes. So I don't wear a cope, and I never wear a hat. I have friends who love berettas and zucchettas and all those things, and of course bishops are known by their hats, aren't they? I knew a bishop once who refused to wear his hat until he was finally consecrated, and the first time he was going to be received into the cathedral, the MC for the service said to him, "Now, Bishop, when you get to the altar, you need to take your mitre off." And he said, "Well, why on earth would I do that?" He said, "Because if you don't, it will fall off when you reverence the altar." Vestments can get us in trouble. You remember last week, the scribe that Jesus was talking to was humble. He was listening. He came to ask a question, and he listened for the answer. And when he got it, he repeated it back. He was a good scribe, as you might say, one whom Jesus said was not far from the kingdom. But in general, says Jesus, you need to beware of scribes, because they really do get hung up in all those fancy clothes and those seats where they're allowed to sit where nobody else sits until they've sat down, because of course you don't want to take the chair that belongs to the scribe. And he says they devour widows' houses. All that money coming into the treasury they use for their own good, and if there's not enough, well, they just take a house from somebody. It sounds very familiar in our political landscape in these last, 150, 200 plus years, just taking people's land, taking people's houses because, well, hey, we're the government, we want it. Not necessarily need it, we want it. So we understand what that means. And we know that while we may benefit from some of those taking of land, we know they're wrong. And we know that we try not to do those things today, although it's happening even as we speak in North Carolina. Maybe other places as well. That's the one I know about. And then Jesus turns to the treasury and he watches people putting their offerings in, putting them in the plate, big money, little money, some money. And then this one poor widow comes and she puts everything she has into that treasury. And Jesus says she's given more than anybody else because she's given it all. She has made a selfless contribution. Why? Well, she didn't bother to explain it, and there was no TV reporter there to say, "Ma'am, could you tell us why you did that?" She just gave it. She was poor. She didn't have to give it. Poor people didn't have to give the treasury temple tax. But she did it anyway. She gave selflessly. We're celebrating All Saints today, and this is a characteristic of those we consider saints. They give selflessly. Sometimes they struggle with it. Sometimes they just do it. And we have in the story of the book of Ruth an example of that selfless love, that steadfast chesed that we talk about. Naomi and her husband Elimelech leave Bethlehem to go to Moab, an enemy territory, because there's food in Moab, and Elimelech wants to feed his family. So he moves, even though it's dangerous, even though it means leaving his land and his family behind, and even, in some respects, people would say, even his God. Because the God of Elimelech was not the God of the Moabites, gods of the Moabites. And while they're there, both of his sons married Moabite women. And as you know from last week's reading from Ruth, Elimelech dies first. He dies without any issue from his sons. They both die. Their names mean something like disease and consumption or something like that. They're terrible names. You know from the beginning they're going to die. But they haven't had children. And so suddenly Naomi is left with 2 daughters-in-law. And Naomi's whole life is wrapped up in family. Absolutely critical to her is family, and she now feels she has none. All of her family have been taken away from her. There is no issue from her husband or her sons left. No one to carry on the name. No one to be her immortality. She leaves the land because she hears that there is food now back in Judah, and she wants to go home, home to her people, home to her God. And her 2 daughters-in-law leave with her. And she tells them they should go home. They should just go back to their families, to their mothers, find a new husband, go on with their lives. They're Moabites, for Pete's sake. They don't belong to Judah. Everybody knows that. And Orpah says, okay, she'll stay. But Ruth says, absolutely not. Where you go, I will go. Where you sleep, I will sleep. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Brothers and sisters, when I got married, I didn't give up my denomination for my husband, let alone my God. Fortunately, he had the same God, but can you imagine how that must have been for her? To strip away everything that identified her, family, land, religion, everything. All she had was being the widow of Mahlon, and that didn't really count for much. But she goes with her mother-in-law. She clings to her, it says in the scripture. And so Naomi returns to Bethlehem with Ruth. And it becomes known to the people in Bethlehem that what Ruth has done for her mother-in-law. I'm pretty sure Ruth didn't tell anybody. She didn't know any of those people anyway. She certainly wasn't going to go around saying, now let me tell you what I did for my mother-in-law. She just did it. She gave up everything for Naomi's sake. So you can picture Naomi's the one who told people. Naomi saw what her daughter-in-law did, even though she was still bitter and sad and angry. She saw what her daughter-in-law had done. And she sends Ruth out into the fields to glean, which was, the common thing at the time was to go out into the fields, and people would leave a margin, an edge, all the way around their fields, and anyone who was poor or who had no fields of their own could come and they could pick up whatever the harvest was from those sort of edges and take it home with them. And he knows who Ruth is because he has heard the stories about Ruth, and everybody else knows who Ruth is because they have heard the story about Ruth. And so despite the fact that she is not just a foreigner, but an icky foreigner, I mean, ugh, Moabite, please, they honor her. And Boaz makes sure that she's taken care of. Boaz tells his young men that they are not to touch her. She's to be left alone, and she is to be given more than others in her gleaning. And so we hear in today's story that Naomi realizes that she must take care of Ruth. And so she sets up this elaborate plan for Ruth to get a husband in Boaz. It's long and involved, and it's a little titillating, so I'll let you read that on your own. Needless to say, it works. And Ruth immediately gets pregnant by Boaz, and they have a son. And from that moment on, Ruth pretty much disappears from the story. It's all about Naomi. The child belongs not to Ruth and Boaz, but to Naomi. It was common for brothers-in-law to marry their widowed sisters-in-law and give birth to a child for their dead brother. But in this case, it's reversed. And Ruth does that for her mother-in-law. And the women of the town name the child, that's a little strange, and they say to her, how blessed you are in your daughter-in-law, for Ruth is worth more than 7 sons. Wow, that's huge, people. They acknowledge the sacrifice that Ruth has made for her mother-in-law and exalt her to the point of 7 sons. Way up here, beyond anything else. Because she was selfless. Because she did not put herself ahead of anybody else. She did not think through the notion that Orpah did, where she could go home. Mom and Dad would probably take her back in, although you have to wonder about that. That she could find someone of her own race to marry and maybe have children of their own, live in their land, worship their gods, just be a Moabite. And Ruth throws it all away because she sees in Naomi someone she needs to care for, someone she needs to give up her life for. That's what a saint does. Not all of them, I confess. There are some who just got to be saints for reasons that I find strange, but then nobody asked me about who could be a saint and who couldn't. But there are people like Samuel Shereshevsky. You've never heard of him. He was an English gentleman, and he left everything he had, and he went to the Far East and lived poorly there as a missionary, translated the Bible into, I don't remember how many languages, but I know Mandarin was one of them. He went to the Philippines and evangelized the people there and translated the Bible into their language. And he was killed there by tribesmen who were afraid that he was going to do them damage. So they killed him as he was coming into land with his canoe and his canoe full of people who were there to evangelize. Thurgood Marshall's another one. He's on the list of saints. Did you know that? He gave his life selflessly for his people. He was absolutely faithful in his worship and in his care for others. When he was proposed for canon, we don't call it canonization, but when he was proposed to be placed on the calendar of lesser feasts and fasts, which is people we worship, not worship, but people we honor in the Episcopal Church as saints. A 19-year-old young man stood up and spoke for him and about him. He spoke eloquently about how Thurgood Marshall had changed his life. This was a 19-year-old child. He was absolutely eloquent and passionate about the life that Thurgood Marshall gave him, not just by his words and his actions, but by his faith. There are far too many to name. Your own St. Philip is amongst those who just went where he was told. We remember the story of his baptizing the eunuch in a ditch. Here's some water. Let's use this. Okay. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't say, well, what do we need here? Where's the prism? Who's got the shell? What's going on? He said, sure. He baptized him. And then he went back to doing what he was doing. There are so many saints. You know many of them. I know in your own lives you have people you feel are saints, people who have cared for you, who have done things that were absolutely selfless for you, who have loved you beyond all measure, who have given up part of their life so that your life might be good and well and healthy. They are saints because they'll put those last 2 pennies in the treasury if that's where it's needed. And if it's in your pocket, if that's where it's needed. We strive to be saints. We aren't going to make it. We might not make it every day, but we'll make it sometimes. There will be people in our lives who we love so much that we are willing to do whatever it takes for them. Think about that. As we pray later for those who have died in this last year, I ask you to consider your own saints, the people in your lives who are no longer with us. And when it's appropriate, please pray their names silently or aloud. Selflessness. It's tough, but it's absolutely necessary. Would you all please stand? And Matthew, you make your way forward.